there, I'm Mandi Isaacs with East Central Educational Service Center, and I'm here to share Chapter 3 of our book, Effective Universal Instruction. And Chapter 3 is Universal Tier Assessments. So before we jump in this chapter, our authors give a quick assessment recap, and I want to make sure that we're all on the same page as we talk about the universal assessments. But today, for the assessment recap, please remember that not all assessments are equal or created equal, and different types of assessments are for different purposes. And so I chose this image because I really felt like sometimes when we hear the word assessment, this is what we think of. We think of our students in a standardized format, sitting down at their desks and taking a test. And that's not really a full comprehensive picture of what assessments means. So as we jump in, there are two main categories for assessments, formative and summative. So as formative assessments are assessments for learning. So I always think of that. They're for the learning. So these are what we're doing all the time, every day in our classrooms as we're assessing what our students know and where we need to go next with our teaching. Oftentimes this could be like our pre-tests, or it could be checks for understanding along the way, our anecdotal notes, my clipboard that I walked around with as students were demonstrating different tasks or writing, and I would jot down those notes to help me later with gearing my instruction, whether it be whole class instruction or instruction for individuals or small groups. So that's our formative assessments. Summative assessments are the assessment of learning. I look at this as the sum of the learning. So it is where students demonstrate what they have learned either during a unit of study. This may also be our standardized tests and things like that. So as we move on in the book, the authors highlight 4 different purposes of assessment. And we're going to dive into each one of these briefly, just to make sure we're all on the same page, because oftentimes we think of assessment and what we're using in our classrooms to gear our teaching. And do we really think about the different purposes that each assessment have? So we'll start off with taking a look at our screening assessments, which oftentimes are called universal screeners or benchmark assessments. These assessments help us identify they're given to all students at the same time throughout the year or the same windows of time. And it helps us see the students who are at, below, or above grade level standards or performance standards with whatever that screener is assessing. We usually want to administer these multiple times a year so that we can see that growth. And most schools, it is 3 times per year. Usually it's what you think of your fall, your winter, and your spring assessments. I know when I was in the school, this was NWEA MAPS testing. We would administer that in the fall, in January when we would come back from winter break, and then again toward the end of the year in April or May. So we're going to be talking about these a lot because they can help us identify the trends that we need for our universal instruction. Second purpose of assessment is diagnostic assessments. These provide information about individual students, and where they're at and what their needs are. So these can help with your instructional groupings and identifying those weaker skills for students that need some additional support. There are formal and informal diagnostic assessments, and oftentimes we think of the informal. Those are usually what we're using a lot of times in the classrooms as we're doing progress monitoring and working with our students, because those are the ones created by the teachers or that we use out of our textbooks. Third purpose for assessment is progress monitoring. So this would be for students who are receiving some interventions or extra supports in the classroom or outside of the classroom. And the progress monitoring helps us see if those interventions are successful for those students. Our authors recommend that those be at least monthly if it's supplemental interventions, and weekly for students who are receiving intensive intervention supports. So there are some guidelines there on what those progress monitoring tools should include. And I always think of those different benchmarks where you have different forms available. So that way, if a student needs to repeat a form or at a level, then they don't have an advantage on that assessment because they've seen it before. So having multiple forms for your progress monitoring is very important. And then the fourth purpose for assessment is outcome evaluation. And this is looking across the system or across the building and what has been implemented to be able to evaluate if those strategies have been effective in whether it's your MTSS system or your intervention cycle. This allows you to see, is what we are doing effective for our goals. The authors also recommend taking a minute as each grade level and looking over your assessments and creating an assessment inventory. So they do have a sample assessment inventory in the book at the end of chapter 3. I went ahead and pulled out kind of the categories that it includes, but having each grade level complete this assessment inventory, it's going to help identify if you're duplicating, because we don't want to keep assessing for the same purpose, and make sure that we're hitting all of the purposes and that we don't have gaps in our inventories. So now we're really going to jump into what the meat of chapter 3 is all about, and that's assessments for our universal tier of instruction. So why do we need to assess our universal instruction? This quote really spoke to me. It wasn't from chapter 3, it was from chapter 1. But the universal tier is the first intervention for all students and is our largest opportunity to have an impact on student achievement. That quote really spoke to me in the book, and it really speaks to why I feel that we need to assess our universal instruction tier. And I'm going to call on a good friend or colleague that we have that I work with often over here, Sherry Burgum. She uses this phrase a lot. I don't think she would claim it as hers, but she uses it a lot, and it has really stuck with me. And that is, the best tier 2 is a strong tier 1. So really, if we have a strong universal tier for our instruction, how many of those students are we going to be able to meet their needs to where they're not going to need to be placed in that tier 2? So that's why we need to assess our universal tier. And how do we do that? We want to do that by reviewing the screening data. We look at the data across the building in those universal screeners, and that helps us identify where those gaps and needs are in our universal instruction. And then we can provide PD and training and support for our teachers in developing a stronger universal core curriculum in those areas to build that universal tier. So the authors dive into that a little bit about with assessing the universal tier. These are some of the questions that a committee or a team within a building might ask to be able to help guide their decision-making in if their universal tier is effective and strong, or if there are gaps in that universal tier. So in thinking about that, looking there at question A, are at least 80% of students meeting expectations at each grade level? So we can pull out that universal screener data, look at them across the grade level, and one of your teams can look and see, okay, are at least 80% of our students. If it's below 80% of our students, then we really need to look at that universal tier because it's not meeting our students' needs. Question B there, that one really spoke to me. Are at least 95% of students who meet expectations in the fall still meeting expectations in the spring? This goes back to that growth, students showing adequate growth based on where they're at when they started in the fall and then in the spring. This was really big also as a high ability coordinator and high ability instructor. This was something that I measured immensely with all of our students who were identified, is looking at them on an individual basis of, are they showing the growth? If they are above expectations in the fall, they still at that above level in the spring. If not, that's where we're going to see their percentiles decrease. And then that's going to show that we're not meeting their needs in that upper, in those challenging texts. So there are some other questions there that the authors offer in chapter 3 for why, how you could look at your universal screening data to assess your universal tier. So we've talked a lot about screening assessments, and if you haven't implemented universal screeners, then the authors do offer some guidelines for implementing those across your school. So the first one is to identify your screening measures, and they give a resource of rti4success.com to look at some of those universal screeners and evaluate them. They do acknowledge that there's really not a single screener at the secondary level, that really if you're a secondary building, a junior, senior high, then you will need to take in several measures of data across the school, including attendance, grades, student performance, the credits that they've earned in high school, and their discipline to help identify the universal needs in your school. Then once you've identified your screening measure, you need to be sure to select an assessment window. You want to make sure that you have a standard assessment window across your district. If you have multiple buildings, you want to make sure that it is the same 3 to 4 week window across all buildings, because that's going to allow you to make comparisons across your districts. And then also it'll allow you to make comparisons from year to year. And that's part of your outcome measures. You're able to look at the outcomes and how effective what you're implementing is from year to year. If you don't have it as a set window, then that's going to vary from year to year and give you inaccurate data to be able to provide the best support and growth for your educators. After you've selected that assessment window, you want to identify the screening process. So who is going to be administering these screening assessments? And the authors offer a couple of options, creating an assessment team or having the classroom teachers. And there are pros and cons to both of these. You know, with an assessment team, you have a team who's been trained, so you know that there's uniformity in the assessments that are given, and it's usually less disruptive and doesn't take up as much of class time. But then when your classroom teachers aren't providing the assessments, they're not as intimate with the assessment, with the student information, for them to know how to utilize that information in their classroom and in their teaching when they're not as close to it. So that's really a conversation that you need to have in your district to determine. It may be a personnel may help determine that, what personnel you have available and the expertise of your team. So now that we've collected all of this screening data, we use these universal screeners. We implement them 3 times a year. But what good is that data if we don't use it? And we as the school need to adopt a process or create a process for our teachers and our teams to be able to use that data to help them with their instructional decisions. So our authors talk about creating collaborative teams, which I think Cindy and Marty talked a little bit about at the end of chapter 2, how effective we are as teams and bringing different viewpoints to the table. And the importance of these collaborative teams is authors are recommending 4 different teams across your district and building. You would have your district team, a building team, a grade level teams, and then a problem solving team, which might also be called an intervention team in your buildings. So the authors really dive into the building and the grade level teams. So that's kind of where I'm going to take off here to talk about how to build these collaborative teams and what they do. So your building team really looks at the school-wide data, and they help identify the themes and the strands in that data to determine what tools and professional learning are needed to support the teachers to be able to support the students. So this is your team, might be called your MTSS team, building wide committee, building leadership team. There's all different types of names for it, but they're really going to help with implementing that MTSS system of supports in your school. And they're going to also help identify what professional learning and support the staff needs. This team should meet at least monthly, and there is a great resource in the book at the end of chapter 3. They have the agendas by month for this team. So it kind of lays out what this team should be looking at each month of the year and to best support the school's needs. So that's a very helpful tool for you. And then getting into our grade level teams. This is your it's what it is. It's a grade level team. I remember in the classroom, this was my 5th grade team. So the 5th grade teachers would come together one day a week during our prep to discuss the topics that were pertinent for our grade level. Now, I think this is a little bit more guided, and I wish I would have had this much guidance in that. I think we would have been much more effective and efficient with our time. But this is where your grade level comes together and they look at that data across the grade level and create grade level goals based on that data. And this is the universal instruction. And so this is what every 5th grader or whatever grade level it is going to get and make sure that they're exposed to. And I think that speaks so much to equity for our students, that a student in my classroom is going to have the same opportunity and to content and information as the 5th grade student in the classroom next door. And that is so important. So, and then as a grade level team, as my own teacher in my own classroom, after that grade level team, I'm going to take that information back too. And then I'm going to look at my classroom data and say, okay, how am I going to meet these grade level goals based on my students' performance? Because I may need to give a little bit more support than my teaching neighbor next door, or I may be ready to accelerate a little bit more if my students have shown that they've achieved those grade level goals. So recommendations from our authors for effective grade level teams include meeting weekly at regularly scheduled times. I think this is so important. Have it on the calendar that every week on Wednesdays at this time we are going to meet. That way everyone knows where it is, when it is, and to be there and be prepared for it. There also needs to be some facilitation roles. So having someone who steps up as that facilitator and takes care of those tasks for the team to make sure that you're ready. Creating your agenda, having the norms and the roles. Each person on the team should be filling a role. And another one of the great resources in the back of chapter 3 is there is a roles list and tasks for each of those roles. So in addition to facilitator, a timekeeper, and different roles like that. And then facilitator would also meet with the principal to keep them abreast of what is going on with your grade level and any barriers or struggles that your grade level is experiencing. So that way your administrators can help provide the support that's needed. There are also agendas by month for grade level teams at the end of chapter 3, which are very helpful in getting you started in what those grade level teams should be looking at from month to month as part of those meetings. The third team, we didn't talk about the district team, but the last team is the problem-solving team. You might call this your MTSS, or I'm sorry, your intervention team. This is your interventionists who have designed those intensive interventions for students that become their tier 2 and or tier 3 supports. As a tier 2 interventions, the authors are recommending that this is a general education team, not a special education team. And the third bullet there I thought was really interesting because I did this a lot as a high ability coordinator. This is how we identified our high ability students, as we looked at those universal screeners and we identified up to a certain percentile. So we used those universal screeners to identify our high ability students. So I think that's an interesting concept that I would advocate for too. Instead of just waiting around for referrals, looking at that universal screening data each cycle, so fall, winter, and spring, and identifying the students who are below the 10th percentile that we know that we're going to need to give them some extra support. So I really liked the idea of being more proactive instead of waiting for that referral. So there are some problem-solving team checklists in the back of chapter 3, along with a problem-solving decision-making model, if you want to more information on that. So I'm going to jump in here. I've just shared a lot with you in a very short amount of time. So and Marty's back with us. Hey, Marty.
Hi there. Thank you, Mandy. I have some notes and I'm excited to see your nuggets.
Awesome. So yep, I pulled 4 things from this chapter from what I just talked about. So the big ones for me were assessments can meet more than one purpose. And to keep that in mind, because that's going to help reduce testing. Because I hear that from teachers all the time is we're testing all the time. So that's where doing that inventory comes in, and then finding out if there's any gaps.
And that was actually one of the things I wrote down as you talked. That assessment inventory, I think as a teacher would be so useful, because you do fall into that, but we're testing all the time mentality. But if I can see what the different tests are giving me and what the purpose is, I think we would have a different mindset about those assessments. And something you said back when you were talking about the inventory was that inventory would also show gaps. And that's important, because it's hard to define a negative, what you don't know. Well, that would put some definition around it.
Great point. I love that. The second big nugget for me was that screening data is used to evaluate effectiveness of universal instruction. A lot of times our educators are looking at screening data to be able to identify students who need extra support. But here our authors are looking at screening data as using that screening data to look at the universal tier and see where our gaps or our weaknesses are there to be able to build that and make that stronger.
Yes, completely. Yes, because like you said, and like Cindy and I talked about, if our tier 1 is not strong, our tier 2 and tier 3 are not going to be as effective. Well, we need to make sure we're evaluating not just our kids, but we're evaluating our instruction.
Awesome. Yes, I like that. We should quote that somewhere.
Okay.
I hope you wrote that one down.
Okay.
Oh, wait, we can go back and watch it. The third big nugget for me was establishing the systems for how the data will be used. As a teacher, you go in your classroom and you kind of get into your classroom and using your data, but we need to establish those systems for our grade level teams and our buildings to use this data.
And I think if it was me, I would include that on my inventory of like where the data is and how we're going to use it, that it would be part of that overall looking at that holistically.
Oh, that's a great idea. Mm-hmm. And then the last one is collaborative teams. They're essential. You've got to work as teams, and how much more we can accomplish when we have that time. And I know that's often the barrier for our teachers and for our schools is that time. So our administrators have to advocate for that time for their schools to have that collaborative team time.
And I would argue I agree with you. It needs to be on the calendar, a set time, but it needs to be enough time in one sitting. It's not 20 minutes here and 15 minutes there. It's enough time to really get something accomplished, which is so hard to find.
It is. It has to be a priority.
Absolutely. Oh, Mandi, thank you so much for this chapter. Assessment is not exactly like something I think we get excited about, but as you showed, we can be more intentional about how we do it and get better results and better data and do it better if we're intentional about it.
Yep. I think that was your key word. The key word is intentional, doing it with intent.
Yes, I think so. I think right there is the key. Not letting it happen to us, but being purposeful about how we go about it, which is, using just that inventory is a huge step in the right direction. All right. Well, thank you, Mandi, for chapter 3. Chapter 4, determining effectiveness of universal instruction, kind of what we just talked about there, Mandi. We set up Michelle nicely to take that one and run with it. That video will premiere on March 16th. So stay tuned for that here on the Keep Indiana Learning YouTube channel. So thanks again, Mandi. We appreciate it.
Thanks.